Welcome to Gateway's Community Services podcast, A Lifeline for a Lifetime. Today we begin our look at New Hampshire's developmental disability system transformed from institutional care to community-based supports people know today. I'm your host, Joanne Sheehan. In this first episode, we're going to go back to the beginning. What services looked like then, what families were facing, and how the first steps towards change began. I'm grateful to be joined by our guest, Sandy Pelletier. Sandy has dedicated more than 40 years to this work, and I've had the privilege of working alongside her for 25 of those years. Her experience spans every major phase of New Hampshire's developmental disability system, from her early work as one of the state's first case managers to her long tenure as CEO of Gateway's Community Services. Sandy earned her master's degree in developmental disabilities from the University of New Hampshire and began her career while still in graduate school. She became one of the state's first 4 case managers in Region 10, also known as Community Crossroads, helping individuals return to their home communities from Laconia State School. After a short time with the Division of Mental Health and Developmental Services, she joined the Plus Company in Nashua to help establish area agency responsibilities for the greater Nashua region. A few years later, when the board created a separate organization, Sandy was asked to serve as its first executive director. For more than 40 years, she has served as CEO of Gateway's Community Services. During that time, the organization has grown to support more than 2,800 individuals and families, helping people live meaningful lives in their communities. Sandy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive in. I want to talk about what the system looked like, in the past at its beginnings. When you first entered the developmental disabilities field, what did the system look like in New Hampshire?
The system looked like back then was many individuals with developmental disabilities, particularly adults, were served in state institutions across the country. And that was also happening here in New Hampshire at Laconia State School. When I was in graduate school, there was a major movement across the country about deinstitutionalization and creating opportunities for people to live a life in their community. And that's what it was here in New Hampshire. There was a major effort to start really looking at what was happening and try to determine if the institution was no longer a place where individuals should be served.
Okay, so when you say people were institutionalized, who was supporting them at that time? Was the state supporting them? Did they get funding from the state?
State schools were funded by the state legislature. Okay. So all of the money that was used to support individuals at that time was by the state government. School services 0 to 21, they weren't entitled at that point. So if you had a special ed child, you weren't entitled services back in that time period, or in the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay, so when people with developmental disabilities, was it like a day school, or did people live there?
People lived there 24/7. A lot of the pediatricians and family practice physicians during those periods prior to late 70s and 80s would recommend that if you had a child with, quote, mental retardation, that was a term used back then, that they should be put in an institution.
And so when they were in, let's just say, Laconia State School, what services actually existed for them there?
It was institutional care. 24/7 care by workforce, direct support workers, and they would help support them living in that concentrated environment at Laconia State School in Laconia, New Hampshire.
Okay, and were families involved in that type of environment? I mean, was that their only option, I guess?
At the time, it was their only option. There were other options, but there usually were families in the community that would create associations for retarded citizens, back then called the ARCs, and Nashua had one, and families had to volunteer and create their own community supports for their sons and daughters during that time period. So organizations like the Plus Company or Gateways didn't exist. Mm-hmm. There might be a few programs that existed back in the day, but there wasn't a lot of options for families. And most of them were driven by family associations because they wanted something, an alternative to a state institution. So those were the two choices. There were, you either took care of your son and daughter in your home by yourself, or you created a volunteer group through an ARC association, an association for retarded citizens, and maybe it was a day program, et cetera, in the community. You didn't necessarily get, when I first was in graduate school in Nashua, it was called Mount Hope School. It was a private school run by family members who sent their sons and daughters there because they didn't get access to special ed and education. So that was, and then if you chose for your son and daughter to go into an institution, it was your choice, and many families were directed to go in that direction. It was an institution, and it was, located in Laconia, and if you could go up and visit, I'm sure, but it was very much, an institutional setting.
So no real community-based supports then?
No, not that I remember.
So I just want to ask you a personal question. Do you remember a particular family or an individual in your early career who shaped how you understood what people truly needed?
When I first started, as you mentioned, I was in graduate school at UNH, and the concept was I was learning about deinstitutionalization, and that's what really motivated me. And there was an opportunity in New Hampshire. They were hiring as a pilot 4 case managers in different locations. And one was in Nashua, one was in Salem, one was in Laconia, and one was in the Peterborough area. And I was one of the first, as was a gentleman here in Nashua that worked for Gateways for a long time, Bill Stumpf. He was the other one assigned in Nashua. And our job was to really look and meet people at Laconia State School from our communities and decide if they could come back and live with some level of support, as well as looking to see if there was anything available. I mean, I can remember so I was hired by Salem at the time, and was given the task to try to bring people out. And one of the first individuals I brought out was from Derry, New Hampshire. I won't give his first and last name, but it was CR. I still have pictures in my office desk with him, and early in my career, and my job was to try to create community opportunities for him. So we worked with the time, group homes were the preferred service at that time, as well as sheltered workshops. So there were a few of those kind of programs that had been opened by organizations like the Salem Association for Retarded Citizens at the time, parents who had come together and said, I don't want the institutional living, I want community living. So he was my first client, and I helped place him in the community with the support of his family. I had to sit at their dining table days on end to convince them that this was a big thing. It was an opportunity. They saw it as a scary risk because pediatricians and doctors had told them to put an individual in an institution, and they agreed to do it. And we placed him, and he was very successful in the community, and he spent a lot of time with my family personally over the years. We became really good friends and allies. Even when I moved to Nashua, he would come and spend the night with my family. My sons remember him well. And so he was my first placement into the community through institutionalization, and it really resonated with me.
So speaking of people's perceptions at that time, how were people with developmental disabilities viewed by the general public, by legislators, or were legislators involved at that time, or even by professionals, doctors, therapists?
How were they viewed? They were viewed marginalized. And they didn't have an equal voice at the table. And I think professionals at the time, from generations, thought they were doing the right thing. And they thought that's where individuals with developmental disabilities needed to be placed. It was in institutions.
So inclusion, independence, and choice didn't really come about until later.
It wasn't until families, like the families in New Hampshire, I know I've shared this story in the past, one of the families, the Garrity versus Gallon lawsuit, it was from Nashua. Sandy Garrity was a client from Nashua. Her family decided to join a number of group of parents who were from the institution. Their sons and daughters lived at the institution, and they filed a lawsuit against Governor Gallen in the late 70s, early 80s. And that lawsuit was where a lot of conversation and consideration by policymakers and others saying we had to do something different. There was a policy that was written, and I'm probably quoted in it somewhere, again, early 80s. The Department of Health and Human Services, because this lawsuit had been filed, wrote a plan called Action for Independence. And that plan identified the opportunity to really work to try to give individuals opportunities in the community. I still have that plan in my desk 40 years later, but it was the design of trying to build supports for people to live lives in their community, and they wouldn't have to be placed in the institution.
So after that lawsuit happened, Laconia State School shut down.
It shut down. The lawsuit was it was filed in the late 70s. It was resolved somewhere in the early 80s. And Laconia State School was the first institution in the in this country to close, and it closed in 1991. And during that period of time, we were asked, many of us who were working in the field, and an example is when I came to Nashua, this was the job given to me. You will serve 50 individuals, 25 from the community, and prevent their institutionalization into Laconia, and you will bring 25 people back. That was the goal of the organization.
How difficult was that for you as like a case manager or in your role?
It was exciting to be part of something new and opportunistic and optimistic, I think. I think the feeling was, wow, we can hopefully, in collaboration with families, make something better happen in the community. And you start to see that policies across the country, and in particularly New Hampshire, we were one of the first in the nation to move in this direction to the level that we are. A lot of people would say, well, New Hampshire was a small state, so you could do it, right? We weren't talking about millions of people. It was an opportunistic, positive opportunistic challenge as well. I mean, it was like there were days that felt really, wow, we're doing something different. We're making something different happen and meaningful for people's lives. And there were other days that were really hard because people didn't want it. Neighbors didn't want it. People were afraid. People had really bad views or negative views of people with, quote, again, I hate using the word, but back then it was informed as mental retardation. So individuals with developmental disabilities and children were really marginalized, and no one really saw them as having value to the community. And I think there were people, I can remember, I have many stories, but I can remember trying to create new opportunities. The challenges were convincing the families, right, after all this time, to take that kind of risk for their sons and daughters. The other was convincing the community. I can remember opening one of the first group homes owned by the Plus Company at the time, called Harbor Ave here in Nashua. And one of the individuals, I tell this story all the time, the individual we brought from Laconia State School decided one night that she was going to go next door and make herself a cup of coffee, instant coffee. And the neighbors were like a little frightened, and the town selectmen were called, and I had to go before the selectmen and the mayor's office early in my career and convince them this was the right thing. And people weren't always aligned with this. There was early in the period of creating the system, and this was across the state of New Hampshire, people were, we don't want this in my backyard. And then,
interesting.
So that was a real challenge.
Interesting. So you would say perception maybe was half and half. Like some families welcomed it, some didn't. Some people were okay with it, some weren't.
I think families overall wanted something better for their sons and daughters. It was their neighbors and the community overall that was resistant.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say families wanted assurances.
It's interesting, somebody told me that people are always scared of what they don't know.
And that's part of it. And it required a lot of education and a lot of support. But when we were able to convince individuals of the importance of this work, people aligned. We got great community collaborators. And we continue to have that.
Yep. So let's talk about the area agency system. Today, Gateways is recognized as one of 10 area agencies, which are designated community-based organizations responsible for coordinating services, advocating for individuals and families, and providing support across a lifetime. So back then, how did the area agencies actually function in those early years?
Well, I want to step back. When the lawsuit was being finalized and the rulings were coming out, this plan, Action for Independence, they had defined that the Department of Health and Human Services recommended to the legislature, New Hampshire legislature, that there should be 12 regional area agencies. They should be established. There should be 12. And they started with a few. And Nashua at the time was one of the first established. There were 3 or 4 established a year over a period of 3 years, 4 a year, 4 a year, 4 a year, over the course of 3 years. And so the concept was New Hampshire is very much community-based. It's very much not just community-based, but a lot of decisions in New Hampshire are made at the local level, and that people don't really, in New Hampshire, support centralized government. And that there's truth to that. We have one of the biggest legislatures in the world, and there's a lot of say at the table. The way that our tax structure is structured, local communities have a lot of voice. So the architects of Action for Independence really felt that in order to have buy-in, that it was best that they were local nonprofits in the community, established in the community. If you look across the country, it's a lot of state offices that do the work that the area agency does. And Massachusetts, for instance, and other states, they don't have the regional nonprofit connection. So this was a pilot, and this was how it was established. And we were, again, the task was the task I had shared earlier, to continue to do that work, to build a community services, look to see what was happening in for instance, and I'll use Nashua, what was happening at the time in Nashua. And there were a few group homes run, and there was a couple of sheltered workshops. That's all there was in Nashua at the time. And then to build on those services and then continue to try to create new opportunities. So
the system was guided by local needs mostly, you were looking at, and not from the state?
There was a framework from the state, but they gave us a lot of autonomy at the local level. Like what was available here in Nashua may be very different than what was available in northern New Hampshire. But to build on that, and to build on what you already had, and it was also to build on, you were representing individuals that had been born here, their families still resided here, and how, the goal was to bring people back to Greater Nashua whose families were here.
So would you say that area agencies were supported locally?
Yes, I think they were.
And was it kind of like, so you said the state had a framework, but were you both like just trying to figure it out as you went along, or did you really follow that framework? Were there shifts and changes?
I think it was, I can just remember a lot of meetings and driving up to Concord all the time, and we'd sit around a big conference room and try to figure out how best to make this happen. So there was a framework, there was a vision to bring people out of Laconia State School, create the necessary services. Back then it was even things like getting doctors to serve them. I mean, going and knocking on a doctor's office doors and saying, will you take individuals with developmental disabilities? I mean, you had to assure that people came back, they had a doctor, they had a roof over their head, they had a day program to go to, they had transportation, they had a dentist, just the core basics, so that they could come back and live in their community.
I feel like that would be difficult, just, creating that,
One person at a time.
One person at a time. Okay.
That was our I guess, mantra. I don't know, the staff that eventually came to work alongside me, that's what we would do. We would say, every individual is different. We would look at their needs. We used to have, we call them service plans today, but we used to have service plans even back then. I can remember writing them on a piece of paper. What was their needs? What did they need to make it successfully in the community? What supports did they need? And what do their families want for them?
Leads me to my next question. What did families want for their children as the area agencies were being built?
They wanted quality life and safe life. I mean, they wanted, I think it took time for people to understand that there were more opportunities out there, that their son and daughter could do more than maybe they thought. I'll just share this with you. So it was, the joke was, or there wasn't a joke, but with some families who knew us well, knew me well, and the board, it was like I would always be promoting something and promoting it as the next best thing. And it was like, oh, a group home for 6 people is really wonderful. And then 3 years later, I'd say, no. Or, well, let's step back. A group home for 12 people was really wonderful. And then a few years later, I'd say, oh, no, we don't want group homes for 12 people. That's more institutional. Like, we want a group home for 6. Or then we would say, oh, we want a sheltered workshop for 50 people doing piecework in, the back room of Simon Street. And then I'd go and say, no, we want people to get maybe jobs at industry. Maybe we'll put 5 or 6 people at, Teradyne or whatever industry was available. Maybe we can convince them that they can have a corner in the room and do work, but they'll be surrounded by people. And then it kept changing. And the joke was, it's evolving, Sandy, and we're always looking for the next best thing to really give people a quality of life. So I stopped saying that was, I'm working with you, and we're going to find, the goal is to have people live meaningful lives, inclusive, meaningful lives. How do we get there? So we closed large group homes. We closed sheltered workshops. And I used to think those were supposed to be good back in the day. And then I said, no, teams of people, and not just me, but we would say, that's not what we want for people. And that's not what families necessarily wanted. Families want, especially now where we are, but families want for their sons and daughters what everybody else has for their sons and daughters. They want a meaningful life, they want opportunity, they want jobs, they want to be able to live independently or not be living with their family members when the parents are 75 years old and they're 55. They want what we all want. And I don't think that's really ever changed. I think the impressions had to change and the expectations had to change.
We've come a long way. I just want to talk about the workforce. Today, direct support professionals are increasingly recognized as skilled professionals who support independence, communication, health, and relationships. But decades ago, what did that look like? So when Laconia State School closed, did those workers come to and take those jobs, staffed group homes, or how did you get the workforce?
Well, I wouldn't say that we did get some staff that worked in institutions like in Massachusetts, not necessarily people coming from Laconia because of the demographics, and geography. But it was, if you were a college student, for instance, this was starting to be promoted, right? And people were now moving. I remember a lot of my cohorts were people that used to work in institutions, were administrators in institutions at the time. And then they said, no, we're moving and we want opportunity to work in the community field. So you saw a lot of that kind of transition happen. When we first started out, it was in New Hampshire. The linchpin of the system was the direct support workforce, the direct support worker, and case managers. And they were valued probably more then than they are now.
Really?
Because I can remember people wanted me to be a case manager. I had a graduate degree, and it was and I can remember I wasn't paid a lot of money, but I thought it was good money back then. And I think over time, some of our positions New Hampshire wanted to close its institution. It was paying a lot of money to run that institution. And we proved to the legislature that we could serve people back in the community for a lot less. And early on, what they did was every time an organization like ours took an individual out, they gave us the exact money that they were paying the institution. So it would help us to create a bigger budget and create a bigger opportunity for the people that weren't going in the institution. So we had convinced the legislature, and I don't remember what the numbers were early on, but hypothetically I could say it costs the state, $75,000 to place an individual in an institution back then. It was like 1/3 the cost to support someone in the community.
Yeah.
And that was eye-opening for a lot of people.
Okay, Sandy, you've helped us understand where the system came from, the limitations, the early assumptions, and the human stories behind that change. In our next episode, we'll explore the present, what the area agency system looks like now, the challenges we still face, and the opportunities ahead. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to everyone listening to part 1 of the area agency system, Then and Now. This is Gateway's Community Services Podcast, a lifeline for a lifetime, and we'll see you in part 2.